Let's think about the future. Considering the role of science and technology in our lives, what would our future look like? Choose between those four scenarios. More of the same, edge of disaster, technological fix, or sustainable development. This video will explore how fields of science and technology have a role to play in hijacking futures of some only to champion futures of others. Often, presumed solutions to social problems such as poverty and hunger end up adding more problems. Those techno-science fixes are often employed by global entities such as the World Bank and larger global corporations to exploit foreign lands. For instance, they might choose third world countries as their experimental laboratory to test their fertilizers and pesticides and increase yield, often at detriment of well-being of individuals, societies, and environments. This is the case of industrial farming in India. Check the YouTube video on the myth of the Green Revolution, hyperlinked in the description section below. Techno-science fixes related to the Green Revolution introduce new social and environmental problems from chemical poisoning, water scarcity, depletion of water wells, destroying biodiversity, and dismissing local ways of farming, among others. Those techno-science fixes favor human timescales over non-human timescales to increase yield that add profits to big companies while introducing additional and far-reaching problems to local communities and environments. Such techno-science fixes realize the desired futures of certain stakeholders over others. Futures, or Sociotechnical Imaginaries, SIs for short, become overdetermined by interests of powerful groups alongside fields of science and technology. After watching the video on the previous slides, we can begin to identify many of the social and environmental problems related to the Green Revolution and industrialized farming in India. Those issues could be represented in an actor network map, like the one presented here, showing various stakeholders and the connections among stakeholders. For instance, we could consider how World Bank, as one main stakeholder in this network, loans money to governments and farmers in India to industrialize their agricultural practices. Miracle seeds, such as rice and wheat, are another stakeholder. Rice and wheat are viewed as a cash crop that feeds the world, or more rightly, the countries who can afford them. Those crops, along with fertilizers and pesticides, also referred to as miracle chemicals, introduce new problems related to pollution, cancer rates, and result in more water being used to grow those cash crop seeds. More water being used necessitates the creation of modern irrigation systems that involve drilling tube wells and constructing dams that lead to flooding of plains, which result in biodiversity loss, especially millet and neem, two endemic seeds to the region. Loss of biodiversity intersects with the loss of cultural heritage, with the submerging of old civilizations because of the dams, and the replacement with artificial towns. New irrigation systems come to replace the Persian wheel, a sustainable irrigation system that is viewed by the World Bank as a primitive system that falls short from those visions or socio-technical imaginaries set by those global stakeholders, those of feeding India and ending conflict and poverty. Here, quote-unquote feeding India and reducing hunger and poverty are socio-technical imaginaries that act like a glue, justifying the presence of each stakeholder in this network. This actor network map allows us to realize how human needs, specifically needs of powerful players, take precedence over the needs of others, including heritage food, local irrigation systems, and even girls through increased cases of female feticide, as farmers realize the role of men over women in operating those new farming technologies, leading to killing of female fetuses. As horrific as this is to hear, female feticide is not a problem local to India, but appears to be tied to transnational actors who want to create new markets for their products and technologies, and perhaps in the process causing more harms than good. So to recapitulate, some of the stakeholders whose desired futures are supported as a result of this green revolution are the World Bank, tube wells, dams, rice and wheat. Now, some of the stakeholders whose desired futures are overlooked as a result of this issue are farmers, the Persian wheel, millet and neem, the plains, all civilizations, and girls with the cases of female feticide. To break away from the dominant human imaginaries of progress and productivity that follow a linear process driving much of technological fixes, we may need to think in cycles. This particular video might be inspiring as you research and develop actions that break away from those technoscience fixes. You can view this video in the description section below. Let's go back to how we started this video by thinking of the future. Future thinking can drive change and action when we come to realize the taken for granted futures we are given and try to act on them. We could refer to those taken for granted visions as probable futures. On the other hand, preferred futures refer to our own activism, trying to achieve what we think is a more socially and environmentally just futures or imaginaries. Of course, those visions of preferred futures need to be supported by the appropriate literature and the research that will come from your secondary and primary research. Here's another example to further clarify this notion of socio-technical imaginary in relation to future thinking. We've seen that one way to define socio-technical imaginaries could be in relation to how our futures and our values may have become overdetermined by a network of financiers, corporations, governments, as well as fields of science and technology. We can even go as far as saying that we are to a certain extent living now those futures or those socio-technical imaginaries. In other words, the futures are not out there, but futures are already here. Palm oil production is but one example of how present innovations in science and technology are driven by fears and anxieties from not having enough food in the future. Immediately then, growing palm trees epitomizes how human needs takes precedence over other non-human needs. We talk about slow violence towards non-humans, but also toward particular groups whose lands are dispossessed as they are forced to pivot their agricultural practices according to imaginaries and futures set by larger corporations, imaginaries on which they have no particular say. You can read more about slow violence in the description section of this video. Conduct further research on the topic of palm oil production. Then develop an actor network map to highlight the various stakeholders related to this issue. Circle in one color the stakeholders whose futures are supported as a result of this issue. Circle in a different color stakeholders whose futures are overlooked as a result of this issue. We can also understand slow violence from the perspective of indigenous people and other dispossessed communities. Watch this video that's further hyperlinked in the description section below. Take note of issues of exploitation, colonialism, and land privatization related to industrial modes of food production. As you think about actions that you can take, consider alternate ways at caring for the land, taken perhaps from indigenous ways of knowing, who teach us that we don't own the land owns us. Consider such knowledges and others in relation to the different kinds of actions and imaginaries that your research-informed and negotiated action projects may bring forward. What could be some actions that allow you to realize the preferred futures for the stakeholders whose voices often go unheard?